Philipp Mainländer begins his philosophy from a place that feels very different from most thinkers. While many philosophers try to explain why existence has meaning, purpose, or direction, he starts with a much darker and more unsettling question. What if existence itself is not something to be preserved, but something that is moving toward its own end? This idea does not come from simple pessimism or emotional despair. It is built through a structured attempt to understand reality by taking earlier philosophical systems and pushing them to their logical extreme. Mainländer is heavily influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer, who argued that the fundamental force behind existence is a blind, irrational will, constantly striving without ever reaching satisfaction. But Mainländer does something radical with this idea. Instead of accepting that the will endlessly continues, he asks what would happen if this will had already reached a turning point. What if the ultimate movement of reality is not toward endless striving, but toward release from it? He begins by reconsidering the concept of unity. Many philosophical systems, especially those influenced by religion or idealism, suggest that reality is grounded in a single, unified source. This source is often seen as perfect, eternal, and complete. Mainländer accepts the idea of a single original unity, but he gives it a completely different interpretation. Instead of viewing this unity as something that continues to exist in its perfect state, he suggests that it made a fundamental decision. According to him, this original unity chose to end its own existence. This is one of the most striking and controversial ideas in his philosophy. He argues that the world we experience is not the result of creation in the traditional sense, but the result of a kind of fragmentation. The original unity did not create the world to expand or express itself. It broke itself apart. In this view, the universe is not a living, unified system moving toward fulfillment. It is the remains of something that has already dissolved. Existence, as we experience it, is a process that follows from that original act of self-destruction. This idea changes the entire direction of philosophy. Instead of asking why existence exists in order to continue, Mainländer asks why it exists as part of a process that is moving toward its own end. From this starting point, he develops the idea that everything in the universe is moving in the same direction, not toward growth in the sense of becoming more complete, but toward reduction, toward the gradual fading of existence. At first, this may seem difficult to accept because much of what we observe appears to move in the opposite direction. Life grows, organisms develop, societies expand, and knowledge increases. But Mainländer interprets these processes differently. He argues that what appears to be growth is actually part of a larger process that ultimately leads to decline. Every system, no matter how complex, eventually reaches a point where it begins to break down. Living beings age and die. Structures weaken over time. Energy is used and dissipated. Even progress, in this sense, does not escape this pattern. It may delay decline or make life more comfortable, but does not change the final direction. Everything that exists is still moving toward an end. This leads to a central concept in his philosophy, which is the idea that the will, instead of striving endlessly, is actually oriented toward non-existence. Unlike Schopenhauer, who believed that the will continues without purpose, Mainländer believes that the will has a direction, but that direction is toward its own cessation. In other words, the deepest movement within reality is not the desire to continue, but the desire to stop. This idea becomes even more significant when applied to human life. If the entire structure of existence is moving toward non-existence, then human desires, struggles, and ambitions take on a different meaning. They are not steps toward a final fulfillment, but part of a process that ultimately leads to an end. Mainländer does not present this as something to fear, but as something to understand. He believes that much of human suffering comes from resisting this direction. People try to hold on to life, to create permanence, to achieve lasting success, but these efforts are always temporary. Because of this, he suggests that a different attitude is needed. Instead of endlessly striving for something that cannot be permanent, a person should come to terms with the nature of existence itself. This does not mean immediate withdrawal or rejection of life. It means recognizing the deeper structure of reality and adjusting one's expectations accordingly. When a person understands that everything is temporary and moving toward an end, their relationship with life changes. Desires lose some of their intensity. The pressure to achieve lasting success begins to weaken. There is less attachment to outcomes that cannot ultimately be preserved. At the same time, this understanding can reduce suffering. Much of human pain comes from the gap between expectation and reality. When people expect permanence in a world that is constantly changing, they experience frustration and loss. By recognizing the true nature of existence, this gap can be reduced. A person no longer expects what cannot be given. They begin to see life more clearly, without illusions about its final direction. Another important aspect of his philosophy is the idea of individuality. Since the original unity has broken into countless parts, each individual being is a fragment of that original whole. But these fragments are not moving toward reunion. They are moving toward dissolution. This creates a different understanding of identity. A person is not part of a larger system that will eventually become complete again. They are part of a process that is gradually moving toward its end. At this stage, Mainlander's philosophy presents a view of reality that is deeply different from most traditional systems. Instead of a world moving toward fulfillment, it is a world moving toward completion through ending. This perspective does not offer comfort in the usual sense. It does not promise lasting success, eternal life, or final harmony. Instead, it offers a form of clarity, a clear understanding of the direction in which everything is moving. And as this foundation is established, his philosophy begins to move further, exploring how this view of existence affects human behavior, morality, and the way a person chooses to live within a world that is not striving to continue forever, but gradually moving toward its own conclusion. As Mainlander continues to develop his philosophy, he turns from the structure of existence itself toward a deeper examination of human life within that structure. If reality is moving toward non-existence, then human behavior, desire, and morality must be understood in that context. This shift is important because it takes his ideas out of pure theory and applies them directly to how a person lives. He begins by looking more closely at the nature of the will. While Schopenhauer described the will as something that constantly strives and never finds satisfaction, Mainlander gives it a more specific direction. For him, the will is not simply blind and endless. It is moving toward its own end, even if that movement is not always obvious. In human life, this creates a contradiction. On the surface, people seem driven by the desire to live, to achieve, and to continue. They seek success, relationships, stability, and meaning. But beneath these surface desires, Mainlander argues that there is a deeper movement in the opposite direction. He suggests that what appears as the will to live is actually a more complex expression of a deeper will that is ultimately directed toward non-existence. This does not mean that people consciously want to stop existing. Instead, it means that the entire structure of desire is part of a process that leads toward exhaustion, decline, and eventual cessation. This idea becomes clearer when observing how desire operates. When a person wants something, they feel tension. They are incomplete in some way and believe that achieving their goal will bring satisfaction. But once the goal is reached, the satisfaction does not last. A new desire appears, and the cycle continues. This constant cycle of desire and temporary satisfaction creates a kind of fatigue. Life becomes a series of efforts that never fully resolve. Even when things go well, the sense of completion is never permanent. Mainlander interprets this not as a failure of human effort, but as a reflection of the deeper structure of reality. The will does not aim at permanent fulfillment, because its true direction is not toward completion in life, but toward the end of striving itself. From this perspective, suffering becomes easier to understand. Suffering is not an accidental part of life. It is built into the structure of existence. As long as there is striving, there will be dissatisfaction, because no goal can permanently resolve the tension created by desire. This leads to a significant shift in how a person should approach life. Instead of trying to eliminate all suffering through achievement or control, Mainländer suggests that it is more realistic to understand why suffering exists in the first place. By understanding that desire itself is part of a process that cannot lead to permanent fulfillment, a person can begin to change their relationship with it. They no longer chase every desire with the expectation that it will solve everything. Instead, they begin to see desires as temporary movements within a larger process. This change in perspective reduces the intensity of attachment. A person may still act, still pursue goals, but with less illusion about their ultimate importance. This creates a quieter, more detached way of living. At this point, his philosophy begins to move toward ethics. If life is not about achieving lasting fulfillment through desire, then what should guide human action? What does it mean to live well in a world that is moving toward its end? Mainländer does not suggest chaos or complete withdrawal. Instead, he develops a form of ethics based on reduction of suffering and acceptance of reality. Since suffering is tied to desire and striving, actions that reduce unnecessary suffering become important. This includes not only one's own suffering, but also the suffering of others. Even within a world moving toward non-existence, human beings still experience pain, conflict, and difficulty. Because of this, compassion becomes meaningful. Helping others, reducing harm, and acting with awareness are not pointless. They are ways of making the process of existence less harsh. Even if there is no permanent solution, there can still be improvement in how life is experienced. At the same time, he introduces a more radical idea. If the ultimate direction of reality is toward non-existence, then the highest alignment with this direction would be to move toward it consciously. This does not mean impulsive action or emotional reaction. It is a philosophical position about the nature of existence itself. However, this part of his philosophy is complex and often misunderstood. He does not reduce it to a simple instruction. Instead, it remains connected to his broader view that life, as a whole, is already moving in that direction, whether individuals recognize it or not. For most people, the practical outcome is not extreme action, but a change in understanding. A person who sees the nature of existence clearly will begin to live differently. They will place less value on temporary achievements and more value on clarity, calmness, and reduction of unnecessary struggle. This leads to a quieter form of life, one that is less driven by constant ambition and more focused on understanding and acceptance. It does not eliminate activity, but it changes its purpose. Another important aspect of his philosophy is how it reframes meaning. In many systems, meaning is tied to progress, growth, or final achievement. But in Mainländer's view, meaning does not come from reaching a final state of success. Instead, meaning is found in understanding the process itself. A person who sees reality clearly, who understands the direction of existence, is living in alignment with truth, even if that truth is not comforting. This creates a different kind of clarity, not a hopeful or optimistic clarity, but a direct and honest one. It removes illusions about permanence and replaces them with a realistic view of how things actually are. At this stage, his philosophy becomes more grounded. It is no longer only about the origin of the universe or the direction of existence. It is about how a person lives day to day with that understanding. Desire becomes less dominant. Suffering becomes more understandable. Actions become more measured. Life becomes quieter, less driven by illusion, and more aligned with the deeper movement of reality. And as this way of living becomes clearer, the next step is to explore how this perspective shapes the final understanding of human purpose and what it ultimately means to fully accept a world that is not moving toward eternal continuation, but toward its own complete and inevitable end. As Mainlander's philosophy moves deeper, it begins to confront its most difficult implication. If existence itself is moving toward its end, and if human life is part of that movement, then what does it truly mean to live with full awareness of this reality? Not just to understand it intellectually, but to accept it completely and allow it to shape one's entire way of being. At this stage, the focus shifts from explanation to confrontation. Because once a person fully understands his view, there is no easy way to return to ordinary thinking. The usual ideas about progress, success, and lasting meaning begin to lose their foundation. What remains is a more direct and often uncomfortable clarity about the nature of existence. He argues that most people never reach this level of understanding, not because they lack intelligence, but because the truth itself is difficult to face. It removes many of the assumptions that make life feel stable. It challenges the idea that effort will lead to permanent fulfillment, or that existence is moving towards some final perfection. Instead, it presents a world where everything is temporary, where striving does not lead to lasting completion, and where the final direction is toward non-existence. This is not a temporary phase or a problem to be solved. It is the structure of reality itself. Faced with this, a person has a choice, even if it is not always recognized as one. They can resist this understanding, holding on to familiar beliefs, and continuing to live as if permanence is possible. Or they can accept it and allow it to change how they see everything. Mainlander clearly leans toward acceptance. But acceptance, in his philosophy, is not passive. It is not simply giving up or withdrawing from life in a careless way. It is a form of clarity that removes illusion and replaces it with a more accurate understanding. This clarity has several effects. First, it weakens the hold of desire. When a person sees that no achievement can provide lasting fulfillment, the urgency behind many desires begins to fade. This does not eliminate action, but it changes its intensity. Actions become less driven by the need to complete oneself and more by immediate conditions. Second, it changes how suffering is experienced. Suffering does not disappear, but it becomes less surprising. Instead of being seen as an interruption or a failure of life, it is understood as part of the structure of existence. This understanding can reduce the sense of frustration that often accompanies pain. Third, it creates a kind of detachment, not in the sense of indifference, but in the sense of not being fully controlled by outcomes. A person still lives, acts, and interacts with others, but with a quieter internal state. They are less attached to results that cannot be permanent. At this point, his philosophy begins to approach what could be called a form of existential honesty. It refuses to soften reality or replace it with comforting ideas. It insists on seeing things as they are, even when that view is difficult. This honesty also affects how a person relates to others. Since everyone is part of the same process, moving toward the same end, there's a shared condition that connects all individuals. This can create a sense of understanding or even compassion. Even within a system that does not promise lasting fulfillment, human experiences still matter in a relative sense. Pain is still painful, and relief is still meaningful. Because of this, actions that reduce suffering or provide support to others still have value. This leads to a form of ethics that is not based on achieving perfection, but on improving the experience of life within its limits. A person who understands the nature of existence may still choose to act kindly, to reduce harm, and to create moments of stability, even if these moments are temporary. At the same time, he does not present this as a final solution. There is no permanent resolution within life itself. Every improvement remains within the same overall structure that leads toward an end. This creates a tension that runs through his entire philosophy. On one hand, there's the recognition that everything is temporary and moving toward dissolution. On the other hand, there's still the immediate reality of living, acting, and experiencing. Mainlander does not try to remove this tension. Instead, he accepts it as part of the human condition. A person lives within this contradiction, aware of the larger movement while still participating in daily life. Another important idea that emerges at this stage is the concept of release. If the will is moving toward its own end, then the final state would be one where striving has completely ceased. This is not described as a loss, but as a kind of resolution. All tension, all desire, all effort would come to rest. There would be no more striving, no more dissatisfaction, no more need to achieve or maintain anything. In this sense, the end of existence is not presented as something negative, but as the completion of a process. This idea can be difficult to fully grasp because it goes against the instinct to preserve and continue life. But within his system, it follows logically from the initial assumption that the original unity chose to dissolve itself. At this stage, his philosophy becomes less about argument and more about perspective. It offers a way of seeing the world that is consistent from beginning to end, even if it challenges many common beliefs. A person who adopts this perspective does not necessarily withdraw from life, but they live differently. They act without the illusion of permanence. They experience without expecting final fulfillment. They think without needing comforting conclusions. And as this perspective reaches its final stage, the question is no longer about explaining reality or even adjusting to it. It becomes a question of what it means to fully accept this view without resistance, and how that acceptance shapes the final understanding of life, purpose, and the end toward which everything is moving. As Mainlander's philosophy reaches its final stage, everything he has built begins to settle into a single, unavoidable conclusion. If existence began through the fragmentation of an original unity, and if every part of reality is moving toward its end, then the meaning of life cannot be found in continuation, achievement, or permanence. It must be understood in relation to this movement toward completion through ending. At this point, his philosophy becomes less about explaining the world and more about how a person stands within it. Not what they achieve, not what they accumulate, but how clearly they understand the nature of existence and how honestly they respond to it. He returns to the idea that the deepest movement of reality is not toward endless striving, but toward release. Everything that exists carries within it this direction, even if it is not consciously recognized. Life continues, grows, and struggles, but beneath all of this is a gradual movement towards stillness. This reframes everything that came before. Desire, effort, ambition, and even suffering are no longer seen as steps toward a final success. They are part of a process that is already moving toward its conclusion. This does not make them meaningless, but it changes their significance. A person who understands this no longer expects life to provide a final resolution within itself. There is no lasting state of completion to be achieved through action or possession. This realization removes a certain kind of pressure. The need to arrive somewhere begins to fade. In its place, there is a different kind of awareness. A person begins to see life as a temporary process that unfolds according to its nature. They still act, still experience, still move through the world, but without the same attachment to outcomes. This creates a quieter form of existence. Actions are no longer driven by the belief that they will lead to something permanent. Instead, they are understood as part of the present moment, meaningful in a limited sense, but not in an absolute or lasting way. At the same time, Mainlander does not reduce life to complete indifference. Even within a temporary and finite process, there is still the immediate reality of experience. Pain still exists. Relief still matters. Human relationships still carry weight within the time they exist. Because of this, he maintains that reducing suffering remains important, not because it leads to a final solution, but because it improves the condition of life within its limits. A person who understands reality clearly may still choose to act with care, to avoid causing harm, and to support others. This introduces a quiet form of compassion into his philosophy, not based on hope for a perfect future, but based on shared existence within the same process. Every individual is moving in the same direction, facing the same limitations, even if they do not recognize it. This shared condition creates a subtle connection between people. Even in a philosophy that denies permanent fulfillment, there is still space for understanding and empathy. At the same time, he brings his most difficult idea into full clarity. If the ultimate direction of existence is toward non-existence, then the completion of this process would be the end of all striving, all desire, and all tension. In this final state, nothing is lacking because there is no longer anything that needs to be fulfilled. The constant movement that defines life comes to rest. This is not described in emotional terms, but as the logical conclusion of the entire system. For Mainländer, this is not a tragedy within his framework. It is the resolution of the problem that existence itself represents. If striving creates dissatisfaction, then the end of striving removes that dissatisfaction completely. However, within human life, this final state is not something that is fully experienced in a direct way. It remains the ultimate direction rather than an immediate reality. What matters is how a person lives with the knowledge of that direction. At this point, his philosophy reaches a kind of stillness. There are no further developments, no additional layers to uncover. Everything has been traced back to its origin and forward to its conclusion. A person who accepts this view completely lives without illusion. They do not expect permanence where it cannot exist. They do not seek final fulfillment in temporary things. They understand the limits of life and act within them. This does not remove all difficulty, but it changes the way difficulty is experienced. Without the expectation of a perfect outcome, failure loses some of its weight. Without the belief in lasting success, achievement loses its illusion of permanence. Life becomes something that is lived moment by moment, without the need to secure a final result. This can create a sense of calm, not because everything is resolved, but because the need for resolution has been removed. In the end, Mainländer presents a philosophy that is both consistent and uncompromising. It begins with the idea of an original unity that dissolves itself, continues through the understanding of existence as a process moving toward its end, and concludes with a view of life that accepts this direction without resistance. There is no promise of eternal meaning, no assurance of lasting fulfillment, and no final state within life that resolves everything. What remains is clarity, a clear view of existence as it is, without illusion. And within that clarity, a person finds a different kind of peace. Not the peace of completion, but the peace of understanding. A quiet acceptance of the process as it unfolds, and a recognition that everything, without exception, is moving toward the same final stillness where all striving comes to an end. Philipp Mainländer was born in 1841 in Offenbach, Germany, into a world that was already wrestling with deep philosophical tension. The optimism of earlier centuries had begun to fracture. The belief that reason, progress, and religion could provide a stable foundation for human life was slowly being questioned. Thinkers like Schopenhauer had already introduced a darker vision of existence, one where suffering was not an accident, but something built into the structure of reality itself. Into this environment came a young man who would take that darkness even further, not just as a theory, but as a complete worldview that challenged the very value of existence. His early life did not immediately suggest the direction his thinking would take. He was raised in a relatively stable environment and followed a practical path in a business, working as a merchant and spending years involved in trade. This period of his life is important, not because it reflects his later philosophy, but because it contrasts with it. He was not isolated from the world. He experienced it directly, engaged with its structures, and lived within its systems before turning away from them. During his time as a merchant, he traveled and worked extensively, particularly in Italy. These experiences exposed him to different cultures and environments, but more importantly, they gave him time for reflection. Unlike someone who begins in philosophy from the start, his thinking developed later, shaped by lived experience rather than purely academic influence. This gave his ideas a different kind of weight, something grounded not just in theory, but in observation and internal struggle. The turning point in his intellectual life came when he encountered the work of Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's philosophy presented a radical shift from traditional optimism. He argued that the fundamental force of reality is not reason or order, but blind will and endless striving that drives all existence. This will does not aim toward happiness or fulfillment. It simply continues, creating desire, dissatisfaction, and suffering. For many, this philosophy was already extreme. But for him, it was not enough. He accepted the idea that existence is driven by something irrational and painful. But he asked a further question. If this is true, why does existence continue at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? If existence itself is bound to suffering? This question became the foundation of his entire philosophy, and the answer he developed was unlike anything that had come before. He proposed that the origin of the universe was not an act of creation in the traditional sense, but an act of self-negation. In his view, the ultimate reality, which he identified with God, did not create the world out of desire or intention, but out of a will to cease existing. This idea is difficult to grasp because it reverses the usual understanding of creation. Instead of a divine being bringing the world into existence as an expression of power or purpose, he suggested that existence itself is the result of a kind of cosmic death. The world exists because something fundamental chose to end itself, and what we experience as reality is the unfolding of that process. In this framework, existence is not moving toward fulfillment. It is moving toward extinction. Every process in the world, every form of life, every moment of change is part of a larger movement toward non-existence. Life is not the goal. It is a stage in the process of ending. This view gave his philosophy a deeply pessimistic tone, but it was not pessimism in a simple emotional sense. It was structured, systematic, and grounded in a specific interpretation of reality. He did not argue that life feels meaningless. He argued that it is, at its core, moving toward its own disappearance. At the same time, he did not see this as purely negative. If existence is tied to suffering, then the movement toward non-existence can be understood as a release from that suffering. In this sense, the end of existence is not something to be feared, but something that gives meaning to the process itself. He began developing these ideas into a comprehensive system, one that attempted to explain not just the origin of the world, but the direction in which it is moving. His writing combined elements of metaphysics, ethics, and a kind of cosmic narrative, presenting a vision of reality that is both unsettling and internally consistent. Unlike many philosophers who present their ideas gradually, his work carries a sense of intensity from the beginning. There is no attempt to soften the implications or make them more comfortable. He follows his reasoning to its conclusion, regardless of how it might be received. By the time he fully committed to philosophy, he had left his earlier life behind. He withdrew from business and dedicated himself entirely to writing and thinking. This shift was not just a career change. It reflected a deeper commitment to understanding the nature of existence, even if that understanding led to conclusions that challenge the value of life itself. What makes his position especially striking is that it does not rely on traditional religious belief, nor does it fully align with atheism. It occupies a space between, where the concept of God is redefined in a way that removes intention, purpose, and permanence. God, in his system, is not a creator who sustains the world, but a force that initiated its own end. By this stage, the foundation of his philosophy was set. Existence as a process of self-destruction. Life as a temporary phase within that process. And reality itself as something that is not moving toward meaning in the usual sense, but toward the absence of it. It is a perspective that does not offer comfort, but it does offer a kind of clarity, one that forces a confrontation with questions that are often avoided. Not just why we exist, but whether existence itself is something that should continue at all. as his ideas began to take a more complete form. What made his philosophy increasingly striking was not just its conclusion, but the way he tried to build it with structure and precision, almost as if he were constructing a system that could not be easily dismissed as mere emotion or despair. He did not want his view of existence to be seen as a reaction to suffering alone. He wanted it to stand as a coherent explanation of reality, something that followed logically from its starting point to its end. He began developing his central work, a project that would attempt to explain the origin, nature, and direction of the universe in one unified vision. But unlike most philosophical systems that aim to justify existence or find meaning within it, his system moved in the opposite direction. It was designed to explain why existence itself tends toward its own disappearance. At the core of this development was his reinterpretation of will. Where Schopenhauer had described will as an endless force driving life forward, he introduced a decisive break. He argued that this force is not truly endless. It has a direction, and that direction is toward exhaustion, toward negation. The will that once expressed itself as existence is gradually undoing itself through the very process of living. This shift changes everything. If the fundamental force of reality is not trying to continue indefinitely, but is instead moving toward its own end, then all of existence must be understood differently. Growth, struggle, desire, even progress itself, are no longer signs of expansion or improvement. They are stages within a process that is slowly dissolving. He extended this idea into his understanding of human life. Human beings, in his view, are not exceptions to this process. They're expressions of it. The desires people feel, the goals they pursue, the sense of striving that defines much of human behavior, all of it reflects the deeper movement of will. But because this will is ultimately directed toward its own end, human striving carries within it a kind of contradiction. People seek fulfillment, but fulfillment never lasts. They pursue goals, but achieving them often leads to new desires rather than satisfaction. This cycle creates a continuous sense of lack, a restlessness that never fully resolves. For him, this was not simply a psychological observation. It was evidence of the deeper structure of reality itself. From this perspective, suffering is not an accident or a flaw. It is an essential feature of existence. It arises naturally from the tension between desire and its temporary satisfaction. As long as existence continues, this tension cannot be completely removed. Yet unlike a purely pessimistic view that ends in resignation, his philosophy introduces a different kind of conclusion. If suffering is tied to existence, and existence itself is moving toward its end, then the reduction of suffering is not achieved by improving life indefinitely, but by participating in the gradual movement away from existence. This idea begins to move into ethical territory, but in a way that feels unfamiliar. Traditional ethics often focuses on how to live well, how to create a good life within the world. His approach shifts the focus. The question becomes not how to maximize happiness, but how to understand one's place within a process that is already moving toward an endpoint. He did not suggest that individuals should simply withdraw from life or reject it immediately. Instead, he saw human awareness as part of the process itself. As consciousness develops, it becomes capable of recognizing the nature of existence. This recognition is not something that stops the process, but something that aligns with it. In this sense, knowledge plays a crucial role. To understand reality as it is, rather than as one might wish it to be, is itself a form of participation in the larger movement. Illusions, false hopes, and blind optimism can be seen as forces that prolong misunderstanding. Clarity, even when it is uncomfortable, brings one closer to the underlying direction of existence. His writing during this period carries a sense of urgency. There is very little attempt to soften his conclusions or make them more acceptable. He follows his reasoning with consistency, even when it leads to ideas that challenge deeply held assumptions about meaning, purpose, and value. At the same time, There's a strange kind of calm within his system. It is not chaotic or emotional. It is ordered, almost quiet, as if the movement toward non-existence is not violent, but gradual and inevitable. This calmness makes his philosophy feel less like a reaction and more like a description of something already unfolding. As his work progressed, he became increasingly isolated in his thinking. His ideas did not fit comfortably within the dominant philosophical traditions of his time. They were too extreme for some, too unconventional for others. Yet this isolation did not lead him to compromise. If anything, it allowed him to push his ideas further without the need to align them with existing frameworks. By the time he completed the first volume of his major work, his system had reached a level of clarity that was both impressive and unsettling. He had constructed a vision of reality where existence is not the ultimate good, where suffering is built into the structure of life, and where the direction of the universe is not toward fulfillment, but toward its own end. This was not a philosophy designed to comfort. It was a philosophy that forced a confrontation with the possibility that the most fundamental assumptions about life might be wrong. And in doing so, it raised a question that few thinkers have been willing to ask so directly. Not how to live within the world, but whether the continuation of the world itself is something to be affirmed at all. As his system reached a more complete and uncompromising form, what began to emerge was not just a philosophy about existence, but a vision that placed human life within a vast, almost cosmic process that moved in a single direction. By this stage, his thinking was no longer developing in small steps. It had taken on a kind of total structure, where every part of reality, from the smallest individual experience to the largest movements of the universe, was interpreted through the same underlying principle. Everything that exists is part of a gradual movement toward non-existence. This idea, once fully formed, reshaped how he understood not only life and suffering, but also history, progress, and even human cooperation. What most people see as advancement, the development of societies, technologies, knowledge, he interpreted differently. These were not signs that existence is improving in a final sense. They were signs that the process is becoming more efficient, more aware, more capable of bringing itself to completion. In this view, history is not a story of progress toward perfection. It is a process of acceleration. As human beings become more intelligent, more organized, and more capable of shaping the world, they also become more capable of recognizing the nature of existence itself. This recognition, in its framework, is not neutral. It contributes to the larger movement. Awareness does not preserve existence. It gradually undermines the illusions that sustain it. This gives knowledge a very different role from what is usually assumed. Knowledge is often seen as a tool for improving life, for solving problems, for increasing control over the world. But in his system, knowledge also has a dissolving effect. The more clearly one sees the structure of existence, the less convincing its promises of lasting satisfaction become. This does not necessarily lead to immediate rejection, but it changes the way one relates to life. He extended this idea into the way individuals experience themselves. The sense of identity, the feeling of being a stable, continuous self, is something most people take for granted. But within his framework, this too becomes part of the larger process. The individual is not an isolated, permanent entity. It is a temporary expression of a deeper force that is itself moving toward disappearance. This perspective creates a kind of distance from the usual concerns that define everyday life. Ambition, success, failure, recognition, all of these begin to lose their absolute importance when viewed within a process that does not ultimately preserve anything. Yet this does not mean that life becomes meaningless in a simple sense. Instead, meaning shifts. It is no longer about achieving something permanent, but about understanding the role one plays within a larger movement. At this stage, his philosophy also begins to take on a more ethical dimension, though it does not resemble traditional systems of morality. He does not present a list of rules or virtues in the usual sense. Instead, He suggests that ethical behavior aligns with the direction of the world itself. Actions that reduce suffering, that limit unnecessary harm, that move away from blind striving, can be seen as participating in the larger process of negation. This creates a subtle but important distinction. Ethics is no longer about fulfilling a divine command or achieving personal happiness. It becomes about alignment with a deeper structure, one that is not centered on preservation, but on release. Compassion, in this sense, is not just a moral ideal. It reflects an understanding of the shared condition of all living beings, all of them caught within the same process of striving and dissatisfaction. At the same time, there is an undeniable tension within this view. If existence itself is moving toward its end, what role does individual action really play? Does anything a person does truly matter within such a vast process? He does not ignore this tension, but he resolves it in a way that reflects the overall structure of his thinking. Individual actions may not change the ultimate direction, but they are part of how that direction unfolds. They are not outside the process. They are expressions of it. This allows for a kind of participation without illusion. A person does not need to believe that their actions will create permanent change in order to act meaningfully. Instead, meaning comes from acting in accordance with the deeper truth of existence, even if that truth does not lead to a final state that can be preserved. As his work approached completion, there was a sense that he had followed his ideas as far as they could go. He had constructed a system that began with a radical reinterpretation of the origin of the universe and extended all the way to the details of human experience. There was very little left unexplored within his framework. Yet what makes this stage of his philosophy especially striking is not just its completeness, but its intensity. There is no attempt to soften the implications, no effort to present the ideas as comforting or easily acceptable. Instead, there's a consistent commitment to following the logic wherever it leads, even when it leads to conclusions that challenge the very foundation of how people understand life. By this point, his philosophy stands as one of the most extreme and uncompromising visions in the history of thought. It does not simply question meaning. It redefines the entire structure within which meaning is usually understood. And in doing so, it leaves behind a perspective that is difficult to accept, but equally difficult to ignore once it has been fully grasped. As his work reached its final stage, the distance between his philosophy and his life began to disappear. What he had built was not just a system to be studied or debated. It was something he believed described reality with complete seriousness, something that could not remain abstract once fully understood. For many thinkers, there is always a gap between theory and existence, a space where ideas remain ideas. But in his case, that space became smaller and smaller until it almost vanished entirely. By the time he completed the first volume of his major work, his system was no longer developing. It had reached its conclusion. Existence, in his view, was a process set in motion by an original act of self-negation, unfolding through time toward its own end. Human life, with all its striving, desire, and suffering, was part of that unfolding. Knowledge revealed this structure. Awareness aligned the individual with it. What remained was not a new idea, but a confrontation. If this understanding is true, then what follows from it? Not in theory, but in life. This is where his story takes on a weight that separates him from most philosophers. For many, even the most radical ideas remain within the boundaries of thought. They influence how a person sees the world, but they do not necessarily determine how a person acts within it. In his case, the connection between understanding and action became direct. He did not present this as a dramatic turning point. There is no evidence of hesitation in the way his philosophy is written. There is a consistency that runs from beginning to end, as if once he accepted the foundation of his system, everything else followed with a kind of inevitability. His work does not build toward a reversal or a reconsideration. It builds toward completion. Shortly after the publication of his major work, at the age of 34, he ended his life. This event is often presented as a tragic conclusion, But within the structure of his philosophy, it takes on a different meaning. It is not treated as a contradiction of his ideas, but as something that aligns with them, an act that reflects the same movement he described at the level of the universe. This does not make it simple or easy to understand. In fact, it raises difficult questions about the relationship between philosophy and action, about the limits of reasoning, and about the point at which an idea moves beyond explanation into something that directly shapes behavior. What is important, however, is not to reduce his entire philosophy to this single act. His work is larger than its ending. It is a complete system that attempts to explain why existence itself tends toward its own disappearance, why suffering is built into the structure of life, and why awareness does not resolve this tension, but reveals it more clearly. After his death, his work did not immediately gain widespread recognition. It remained relatively obscure, overshadowed by the thinkers who influenced him and those who came after. But over time, it began to attract attention from those willing to engage with its depth and its difficulty. What they found was not just a pessimistic view of life, but a philosophy that follows its logic without compromise. A system that does not stop at discomfort, but continues through it. This is what gives his work its lasting impact. It does not offer solutions in the traditional sense. It does not provide a path to happiness or fulfillment. Instead, it presents a perspective that forces a re-examination of what those ideas even mean. His philosophy leaves behind a kind of silence, not because it has nothing to say, but because it reaches a point where language itself begins to lose its ability to provide closure. It describes a process that cannot be reversed, a direction that cannot be changed, only understood. And within that understanding, there is a strange tension. On one hand, his system removes the traditional foundations of meaning, purpose, and progress. On the other hand, it replaces them with a different kind of clarity, one that does not depend on illusion. This clarity is not comforting. It does not simplify life, but it does something else. It forces a confrontation with reality at its most fundamental level, without turning away, without softening its edges. In the end, his work stands as one of the most extreme attempts to answer a question that lies beneath many philosophical systems, but is rarely followed to its conclusion. Not just why we exist, but whether existence itself is something that ultimately justifies its own continuation. He did not leave behind a philosophy that people easily adopt. He left behind one that people struggle with, return to, question, and often resist. But once encountered, it is difficult to forget because it does not simply offer an idea. It presents a perspective that reshapes how every other idea is seen. And that is where its power lies, not in providing answers that settle the mind, but in raising a level of clarity that makes simple answers no longer sufficient, leaving the individual to face a question that has no easy resolution, but cannot be ignored once it has been understood.